can't take one more step towards you, 'cause all that's waiting is regret. Don't you know I'm not your ghost anymore? You lost the love I love the most. Learn to live half a life, and now you want me one more time. And who do you think you are, running around leaving scars, collecting a jar of hearts and tearing love apart?
Hey everybody, what's up? This is LA Knight, and I am back again with a review for the book Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, The Last Man in the World by Abigail Reynolds. Actually, this is less of a review and more of a discussion of a thing about the book, but before that I'm going to review the book. That'll only take like 2 minutes after I explain the book, which will take about 1 minute. So, this book is one in a series of Pride and Prejudice variations by Abigail Reynolds. Now, Pride and Prejudice is a book written by Jane Austen back in the... It was actually written in the late 1700s, but wasn't published until the 1800s. And it was actually rewritten and then published. It was the first book that she wrote, it was the second book she wrote, but the first one that she published, I believe. And it's about this girl named Elizabeth, and she's one of 5 daughters, and they have no brothers, and their house and their estate is entailed away through a will to male progeny, and so they can't inherit the house, and since they have no brothers to inherit, once their dad dies, they're gonna get kicked out of their house, and their stupid, ugly cousin, and I say ugly like I don't mean physically ugly, I mean he's like got an ugly soul, their stupid, ugly cousin, Mr. Collins, is gonna move in, and they're all gonna be homeless, and so the mom, Mrs. Bennet, is like super obsessed with getting them married, and all but 2 of them get married in Pride and Prejudice. Jane, the oldest, marries the guy that she falls in love with at the beginning of the book, and Elizabeth ends up marrying Mr. Darcy, the guy who's, you think at first he's the antagonist, but he's actually not, and it turns out he's actually a really good guy, and then their youngest sister, Lydia, ends up marrying the antagonist, because she's too stupid to realize that he's a bad guy. So, the Pride and Prejudice Variation series is a series of books that each book takes one thing about the original book and changes it, and then follows through on what those changes would mean for the plot. So, in this particular instance, this book, Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, Last Man in the World, is a reference to, the title is a reference to something that Elizabeth says when Mr. Darcy proposes to her midway through the book. At this point, Elizabeth doesn't realize that Mr. Darcy actually has any kind of feelings for her. She doesn't like him at all because of a lot of the things that he's said and done. He's very snooty. That's why it's called Pride and Prejudice. He's very proud, and she's very prejudiced against rich people. They actually show this, like one of my favorite lines in the 2005 movie is when she's talking about Mr. Darcy, and she's like, but he's so rich. And somebody's like, good heavens, Lizzie, what a snob you are. Yeah, so... in this, she doesn't realize that he's fallen in love with her, and so he asks her to marry him. Now, in the original, he asked her to marry him, and they were in a private sitting room, and she said no, like, unequivocally. She was just like, no, it's not gonna happen. And he was like, why? Like, what's wrong with me? After, when he asked, he was like, I realize that, like, this relationship can go frickin' nowhere, and that, like, you're totally unsuitable, and, like, I'm so rich and amazing, and your family sucks so bad, but I've deigned to ask you to marry me anyway, so can we do it? And she's like, no. And he's like, what? So, in the original, that happened in private. In this version, they were actually out for a walk in the gardens at the area where they both happen to be staying for 2 completely different reasons. Turns out that a friend of hers is married to somebody who works for Mr. Darcy's aunt. So he's visiting his aunt, and she's visiting her friend, and they live in approximately the same area. And he asked her to marry him, and he assumes that she's going to say yes, because he has no reason to believe that she'll say no. And this is actually true in the book also, in the original book also, which is why he's so stunned when she says no. But in this, he doesn't give her a chance to say no. He's just like, I know I can make you happy, and then he kisses her, and people see him do this. And they're like, what the hell, dude? And he's like, what? I just asked you to be my wife. Because in this time period, you couldn't just kiss a girl. You had to at least be engaged, if not married. And everyone's like, oh, that's so great. Well, if she says we're not getting married, she's going to attain a reputation of being a loose woman. And it's like, it's super stupid, but it actually is, like, the fact that this is so is stupid, but it's actually true. This would totally happen. If this really happened, she would be stuck having to marry this guy. And so it's about how she has to marry him, and then she starts to fall in love with him after they get married when she realizes he really does care about her. but she doesn't realize the kind of sacrifices he's willing to make if she brings them up, because she has no reason to believe that he would sacrifice his, rules and rigidity for her. And so it's the premise of the book is basically the same as the premise of the original. It's a relationship that is confounded by misunderstandings and then ends up getting a happy ending, except that in this case, unlike in the original, they're married most of the book. Now, I really like the book, and I really like the way Abigail Reynolds writes for the most part. She has never written a book in this series that I've read so far. There's 3 that I haven't read, out of 12, 15. She hasn't written any that I've read so far that I didn't like. However, there is a problem that I have with this book, and when I first read it, I didn't actually have this problem because I didn't realize the implications of the issue. And now I'm, older, and I've read it more than once, and on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, Darcy and Elizabeth forever. On the other hand, I'm like, wait, okay, and then this is a thing with the genre itself. Now, in romance novels, romance is like a genre by itself. It pulls in billions of dollars a year, and there's a whole lot of rules for writing romance, and you would think some of the rules that you would think would be there actually aren't there. And one of them is the nature of consent is different in romance novels than it is in real life. And I didn't realize that at first until actually 50 Shades of Grey came out, and a lot of people talked about the lack of consent in 50 Shades of Grey. And I thought about it, and I'm like, why didn't anybody catch that? And then I realized, looking back at all the romance novels that I've read and the things that I've read about writing romance novels and stuff, that the rules of consent for romance novels versus other books, and this goes for erotica also, so romance and erotica versus other books versus real life is very different. And it shouldn't be, but it is. And I know why it is. That's a whole big complicated history lesson that I'm not going to get into right now. But suffice to say, it's different. So here is also, that's another reason why it took me a while to really figure out what it was I wanted to say about this book. So the book itself, taken at face value, without looking too deeply into it, keeping in mind all of the rules of romance writing and blah, 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 is a good book, and I really enjoy it. And I would recommend it to people, except I would add this caveat. Now, here's the thing. Consent is very messed up and tricky in this book if this was a real-world situation. Again, consent and how it applies to the plot in a romance novel is very different. Rape, like violent rape, is... And, yeah, okay, every act of rape is an act of violence, yes, I know. But violent rape, where, it's physical force, there's no quote-unquote romance to it. This is a really tricky concept. I hope this doesn't take forever to explain. But what would constitute rape in real life, for some reason, does not always constitute rape in a romance novel. And I think actually one of the reasons why consent is being pushed right now, and why understanding of consent is so messed up right now, is because of this. I think that, people internalize a lot of things from the books that they read and the movies that they watch and blah, 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 blah. And I think that is part of the problem. So what does that have to do with this book? The fact that Darcy kissed Elizabeth without her permission, and then ended up, because of this, married her, and she felt coerced into marrying him. And then they had sex. The sex she had was under coercion. He doesn't know this, but it is. And then once he finds it out, they stop having sex. Once he finds out she never wanted to marry him, they do stop having sex. Until they actually, start working on their relationship, and then she comes to him, and she's like, I want, to be intimate with you, and he's like, I don't expect anything, because that totally wouldn't be fair, and she's like, no, I'm serious, I'm consenting, let's have sex, let's do it now. And he's like, oh, okay. On the one hand, it's great, okay, so, he didn't know that she didn't want it, but she didn't want it, and then later she does want it, and so they have it, and it's okay, that's fine. And, this one book by itself, I guess, if this was, an anomaly, wouldn't be a problem. But this is something that you see in romance a lot, is that women are coerced in some way into having sex. And, sometimes it's a coercion that the male lead doesn't even realize is there. If it's a marriage of convenience, the girl has to have sex with the guy. I remember when I read I read the very beginning of Girl of Fire and Thorn, and in Girl of Fire and Thorn, the main character gets married at the beginning of the book. It's an arranged marriage, and then it's her wedding night, and the guy that she's married to is like, hey, you know, how you doing? And she's like, I really don't want to have sex right now. And, like, he respects that, like, and he doesn't push it. He's just like, oh, okay. And so they sleep in the same bed together, but he doesn't try to touch her or anything. But on the other hand, I'm, like, as a reader, I'm like, good for him to not push her. But on the other hand, I'm like, this is an alliance. She has to have sex in order to consummate this marriage. The marriage is not legal until they consummate. So without the sex, they're not legally married, which means the alliance isn't set yet. And that then led me to, okay, so now we have this teenage girl who's in this situation where she has to let this man have his way with her body in order to save the lives of all these people. And, like, I don't know, like, because of the way it's written, this is written as, like, this very terrible thing. This specific kind of book is, like, you know, the arranged marriage, okay, I don't want to have sex right now, that would bother me. But then in other books, you've got a situation, like, where it's a marriage of convenience, like in a lot of historicals, not to secure an alliance, but usually it's to avoid destitution or something like that. Or like in Mr. Darcy, you know, Last Man in the World, she had to marry Darcy to save her reputation. And in a situation like that, when a woman is expected to provide sexual favors to a man that she doesn't want to give them to, the fact that this is such a prevalent trope in romance really bothers me. So, like, if this book was an anomaly, if this was the only time that I'd ever seen this, or one of the only times that I'd ever seen this, it wouldn't be super weird. I wouldn't be having this podcast. I wouldn't be talking about this. But it's not. I see it a lot. One of the first romance novels that was, you know, marketed as a romance novel that I ever read was Rosehaven by Catherine Coulter. And not only does the male lead marry the girl in order, because it's like a whole inheritance thing and she has to get married or else the crown's going to repossess her lands and her dad is, like, going to die. So, like, they get married and then her dad dies, like, literally right after that. And so to keep the crown from taking their lands back, she has to marry this guy. And the guy knows that this is why she's marrying him. He doesn't love her. He knows that she doesn't love him. They don't even know each other. They literally meet right before they step into the church. And then he expects them to have sex. And she's like, I don't want to. And he's like, okay, but I don't care. And she's like, and again, going back to the whole thing with violent rape, every act of rape is an act of violence. In this, he actually does rape her, but it is not written that he raped her. And that's something that I didn't notice it, because I was only like 12 when I read this book, so it didn't occur to me that this was bad, because he does everything he can so that it's not painful for her. But that doesn't mean he didn't violate her, and I didn't get that as a kid. And this is a thing that is in romance all the time. In romance novels all the time. He literally, she was like, get out of my room, and he was like, no. And so he pins her down, like, uses some stuff so that, like, she's not, like, super gonna get really hurt by this, and then rapes her. And she's just like, and the whole time she's like, you suck, I hate you, get off me, blah, 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 you know, you're a pig, go away. And he's like, look, I'm your husband, and, you know, we have to do this so it's legal, so stop complaining. And she's like, seriously? And then later it happens again, and she's like, how dare you? And he's like, look, you're my wife, legally I have the right to have sex with you whenever I want. And she's like, okay, but I don't want you to. And he's like, I'm not hurting you. Like, that's the definitive thing he says. That's his excuse. I'm not hurting you, so stop complaining. And the thing is, Catherine Coulter is, like, a famous romance novelist. She's, like, up there with J.D. Robb. She's written at least 100 books. She's a New York Times best-selling novelist, and that's in her book. Like, she does that a lot. Girls end up in situations where basically they're being raped, and it's not portrayed that way. But if that happened in real life, that would totally, absolutely, that guy would go to jail. Like, at least I would hope. I don't know. Like, I mean, I do know. That guy would get prosecuted. Whether he would get convicted, I don't know. It depends on where he lives, I guess, and who he is. But he would absolutely get prosecuted, because that is rape. And so that's actually what this is about, this podcast, excuse me, is the prevalence of coercive sex, non-violent rape, and just sexual coercion of any kind in romance novels, which is also in this book, but not to the same degree, but it's still there. And how this is normalized in the genre. And I realize I only gave you a few examples, but, like, as an example, in Naked in Death, and I'm going to talk about this a little more in my review of Naked in Death by J.D. Robb, in Naked in Death, which isn't technically a romance, but it's written by Nora Roberts, the main character, when she has sex with the male lead for the first time, at one point she says no. And she's not talking about the sex specifically. She's talking about something specific. She's not talking about the sex in general. She's talking about something specific that the guy did while they were in the act of getting ready to have sex. He doesn't know that. He's not psychic. He can't read her mind. He doesn't know why she's saying no. But he chooses to ignore the no. What his appropriate response should have been to stop and be like, what do you not want me to do? Like, what is it? Do you not want to do this? And instead, he looks at her face and then decides, you know what, never mind, I'm just going to do it. You know, whatever it was that he was doing. And what it is, I think what it is she doesn't like having her hands pinned, is the thing. And so, like, he pinned her hands, and that's when she said no, but all she said was no. Or she said, like, no, I can't, or something like that. And he was like, yeah, you can. And then they had sex, and it wasn't shown as being a bad thing. And in real life, like, that would not be okay. Like, if I say no to my husband, I expect him to back the fuck off. I mean, now, granted, you know, he and I, we've been married for a while, so, like, if I'm saying no and I'm being playful, you know, most of the time he can tell, but if there's any kind of confusion, he's like, wait, are we being serious right now? Like, he asks. He makes sure. And so that's, like, my big issue with this book and the romance genre in general, is that consent is, like, a huge non-thing in the genre, is that, like, as long as it's not violent, like, you know, pinned down, girl screaming, get off me, help, 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 rape, then it's not rape, and that's not necessarily true. And, yeah, it's just, I don't know, it's just, it bothers me, and it bothers me more the older I get, because I see so many, I didn't talk to a lot of girls when I was a girl about their, you know, sexual encounters, because where I grew up, you didn't do that, and then when I got older, and I was still, you know, a teenage girl, but most of the girls I was hanging out with weren't having sex. So, like, I didn't talk to them about their ideas of consent and what was okay and what boys had a right to do and what they didn't have a right to do. But now that I'm older and I talk to a lot of girls in that age, you know, between, like, 10 and 20, they have all these ideas about what boys are allowed to do that now me as an adult, I'm, like, and I hate being an adult, but as an older adult, I'm like, you know what, actually, that's really not okay. But I see that mindset reflected in a lot of the romance novels that I read as a kid and the ones that are still being put out there. And actually, when I was, you know, personal time here, when I had a boyfriend when I was about 16, 17, he pressured me into doing a lot of things I didn't want to do. But he told me, you know, that whole line about if you really loved me, then you would do it because other girls do it for their boyfriends because they love them, blah blah blah. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with doing this, so you should just do it. Like, because of a lot of it was because of the things that I read. A lot of women didn't say no when guys are like, I thought you loved me, and then the girl's like, oh, I do, and then they do the thing, and that really actually kind of messed me up a lot. Like, I didn't realize at the time that actually that's not okay. You don't get to say that to somebody. You know, if you really loved me, then you would do this thing that you're not comfortable doing with your body. Like, that's not okay. And so that's my biggest issue with this book. I really like this book, and so I'm really conflicted because, like, it's not so bad, quote unquote, as other things that I've read, but it's still there. So, yeah, this isn't quite exactly as structured as most of my reviews, but that's the thing that bothers me, is that. So it isn't really even a review. It's a discussion prompted by a 5-minute review at the beginning of a book, a discussion about consent in romantic literature. So yeah, you know, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think, what you have to say. Do you guys have anything you want to chime in with on this discussion? Have you seen this before? You know, what do you think? I'd love to hear some opinions and, you know, some discussions about this. I love watching discussions almost as much as I love participating in them. So, you know, go forth and discuss. And I will talk to you guys in the next podcast. Bye-bye.